There is a door in my house that has never been opened. At least not in the 20-plus years that I've lived here with my family. My wife, who grew up in the house, didn't remember it being open either. When I tried to talk to her family about it, they quickly changed the subject. Something was up with it, but as usual, life got in the way, and I mostly didn't think about it. Then my wife decided to rearrange the basement. See, this door was in the basement, and until her endeavors, had been blocked by about 1.5 tons of junk. The door in question was in the most shadowed corner of the understairs storage closet. I've always assumed that it leads to another closet, dug out when the basement was poured back in the early 40s. But I guess it got shut and locked early in the house's life. In any case, it was locked now, and had been since the first time I laid eyes on it. The lock was a large iron padlock and had long ago rusted from the inevitable moisture that could be found in an old basement. The hinges, too, were iron, long bands that stretched 1/3 of the way across the surface of the wooden door. The door appeared to be made of vertically aligned ancient 2x6s, and I pictured them held together by 2 or 3 horizontal 2x6s used as straps. Shelley caught me staring at the door. What?
Oh, that door! Don't you ever wonder what lies behind it?
Not really. I think I asked Mom about it once shortly after Daddy died, when she was doing all her remodeling with the insurance money. I think she said it was an old well that the original owners installed.
I thought your family was the original owner.
Nah, Daddy bought this place after the war in '47, I think.
So, has anyone in your family ever opened this door?
Oh, I'm sure they did back in the day. I'm pretty sure Mom said Daddy was the one that locked it up. And that was pretty much that. We went back to cleaning out the closet and rearranging the basement family room. That is, until about 3 weeks had gone by, and I found myself standing in the understairs closet once again, staring at the door. I don't even remember going there. Shell was in the laundry room just outside the closet door, loading the washer. What are you doing in there?
Hey, did your mom ever say why your dad locked his door?
Shell walked over to the closet door and found me standing in the dark. She turned on the overhead light. What is your obsession with this door?
Doesn't it bother you having a locked door in your house?
Not particularly. I assume Daddy locked it when they started having kids, as it was probably defunct, and he didn't want anyone falling in. Well, of course that made sense, so I backed out of the closet, turned off the light, and shut the door. I was even able to put the door out of my mind, for a couple of weeks anyway. 2 more weeks passed before I thought about the door again. I guess that's when things started to get weird. I was stretched out on the futon in the basement family room, watching our new 48-inch television. Netflix, if I recall. Probably some B-grade horror film. And no, what has nothing to do with what happened. I watch horror to relax. It is kind of my thing. I was deep into the poorly constructed plot without really knowing what was going on when I sort of blinked and looked around. All our animals were laying on the floor between the TV and myself. We have 2 dogs and 4 cats. And while it's not so strange that all of them were downstairs with me, it was odd that they were behaving so well that I didn't notice them join me. Usually at least one of the cats is hissing at one of the dogs, or the dogs are fighting over a chew toy. Typical pet behavior. No, they were just sitting there quietly. Some of them watching the television, some of them watching each other. All of them breathing quietly with an occasional blink. I stared at them in wonder, somewhat bemused. I whistled for Domino. He looked at me but didn't move. Now that was strange, as Domino was my fox terrier lab mix. That was truly my dog and always came when I called. Domino, come here. He whined slightly but still didn't move. I started to rise when, as one, all 6 animals suddenly turned and stared toward the door of the utility room. Inertia forced my gaze in that direction as well. The accordion door we'd put there was closed, undisturbed. I heard nothing. I turned back toward the animals. What's up, guys? For an answer, the cats, Ace, Socks, Pink Boots crouched tensely, poised to either attack or flee, their tails like metronomes flicking back and forth in a not-so-friendly manner. Domino and Cookie came quietly to their feet, growling low, deep in their throats, the hackles on the backs of their necks rising. Cookie, a boxer lab mix, without a mean bone in her body, looked and sounded positively fierce. Jesus, guys. It's the fucking laundry room. Chill. But chill, they did not. With a roll of my eyes and an exaggerated sigh, I rolled off the futon and got wearily to my feet. Fine, let's go see. I walked the short distance across the corner of the room. I wasn't particularly nervous. Animals were weird. I grasped the edge of the door and pulled it open dramatically. Nothing. Nothing but a dark room. The understairs storage door stood to the left beyond the freezer, and to the right was the AVAC room, while in front of me stood the washer and 2 dryers. I flipped on the lights, and as soon as I did, the animals all rushed into the room. The cats leaped to the top of the upright freezer, hissing. The dogs went to the center of the room, growling. Domino began to bark sharply. All 6 animals were staring at the understairs storage door. What the actual fuck? I started for the storage door, confident that the animals had, for some reason, gone bug, fuck, crazy. Cookie crossed in front of me, hackles raised and teeth bared. She wouldn't let me pass. God damn it, Cookie! Get out of my way! I shoved at the dog, but she snapped at my hand, very out of character. Grunting, I forced my way past the dogs. They growled and snapped. Did everything but bite me. But I finally reached the storage door and yanked it open. I yanked on the string of the lone bulb and the dog suddenly slinked away, whining piteously. I glanced at the top of the freezer and cats were gone, literally just gone. Shrugging, I walked into the room. There was nothing there. Nothing. Shelley had cleaned it out and painted it a staggeringly bright white, gleaming even in the yellowish glow of the single bulb. And there stood the door. It hadn't changed. It had the same black, rusty hinges, the same heavy black and rusting lock. The wood was still old and dark, slightly damp. Nothing had changed. Or had it? Something seemed subtly different. I approached the door slowly, my old friend anxiety ramping up unexpectedly. This is ridiculous, I thought, approaching the locked door. Why am I suddenly so nervous? I placed a hand flat against the old wood, rough and slightly damp, just as expected. What was that smell? It wasn't just the usual musty damp of an unfinished basement room. There was something else. I pressed my nose up against the faint gap where 2 of the 2x6s came together, expecting to bring on a bout of allergy-induced sneezing. Instead, I nearly gagged as the sickly sweet stench of rotting flesh filled my nostrils. I turned away abruptly, stifling a retch. Wonderful! Something has crawled in there and died. Great! It didn't occur to me to wonder how whatever it was got in there probably tunneled in from outside anyway. What I did know, the longer I left it, the stronger the smell would get, until it eventually permeated the entire basement. After all the trouble she had gone to cleaning up the area, that would not be appreciated by my wife at all. Therefore, it left it to me to get that door open somehow and remove whatever had died. I promptly left the room and headed to the only other room in the basement, the master bedroom. Shelley kept a jewelry box of odds and ends on her dresser, and I was thinking that it might just hold the answer. I popped open the wooden box and began rummaging through assorted old earrings, tie clips, political buttons, and rings, until I found the large ring that held assorted keys. Just as I suspected, one of the old keys was a large iron skeleton key, perfect for the lock on the strange door. I snatched the key, closed the box, and went back to the storage room under the stairs. The smell was already worse. It hit me just as I entered the closet, making my eyes water. I held my breath and approached the door, jamming the key into the old lock. It fit perfectly, but when I tried to turn it, It only turned about 90 degrees before becoming stuck firm. I twisted with everything I had, but when the key started to bend, I gave up, fearing it would break. Frustration surmounted anxiety as I removed the key and stared at the lock. Damn thing was probably rusted shut anyway. Then I had to leave the storage closet as the smell was really getting to me. Looking around, I noticed the animals were no longer anywhere to be seen. I would have thought the smell of rotting meat would have attracted at least the dogs, but it seems that wasn't to be the case. Fortunately, if I didn't stand inside the storage room itself, the smell was negligible and didn't seem to be getting worse. Still, Shell would want me to do something, and now that my interest was piqued, I was determined to get that door open. I went upstairs and outside to the detached garage. I was pretty sure we had a stout crowbar somewhere. I unlocked the side door, held shut by a modern combination lock, and groped along the wall to the only light switch, inconveniently located next to the overhead door, which was permanently jammed shut. It took a few minutes, but I managed to locate the tool I was looking for and headed back into the house. I left the garage light on as I figured there was no telling what else I would need. Besides, the light was comforting in a way I couldn't quite place. Not wanting to face that smell again, I went to the foyer where a knit bag hung that held a bunch of swimming gear and dug out a pair of nose plugs. I put them on and headed back downstairs. I didn't see any of our pets, as they must have gone into hiding. Something had certainly spooked them. I went back into the storage closet and the nose plugs did help. The smell was still quite present, but at least it wasn't overwhelming. I wedged the end of the crowbar through the lock's shackle and braced it against the door. I pulled against the bar with everything I had, and with an ear-splitting shriek, the black metal stretched and finally snapped. I stumbled backwards, dropping the crowbar with a clang and nearly falling to my knees. Domino came running at the sound, but stopped just outside the storage room, growling. I looked at the dog with its hackles raised and half laughed. "What is it, boy? Is Timmy stuck in the well?" My own nervous laughter followed my half-assed attempt at a joke, and I glanced around like I expected to be judged. Domino only growled lower, crouching down until his belly touched the floor. I glanced at the door, somehow even more ominous now that the lock had been removed, although it remained quite shut. I toward the door with something approaching trepidation. The door didn't have a modern knob or even an old-fashioned knob, but rather a squared-off shaped bar of twisted iron that served as handle. I grasped the handle with my left hand and pulled. The door didn't budge. I held on with both hands and pulled. Nothing. I took a deep breath, praying that nothing in this fetid air would make me sick. Braced myself and pulled with everything I had. Just as I was about to give up, the door began to inch open on straining hinges as rusty iron gave way to sheer stubbornness. When the door was about a foot ajar, such a waft of horrendous air puffed out that I had to bolt from the room, gasping for breath and nearly tripping over the poor dog. Whimpering, Domino backed away, slunk low to the ground, refusing to take his eyes off the entry to the storage closet until he had backed all the way out to the family room. I joined Domino in the other room, still trying to catch my breath. I reached into my pocket for my emergency inhaler and took a couple of puffs. That helped. I grabbed my glass off the bookshelf and took a swig of what was little more than melted ice at this point in the evening. That, I said to the dog, was nasty. Oddly enough, however, the smell still did not reach the family room, and as I made my way back to the utility room, it was still barely noticeable, but within the storage closet, it was nearly overwhelming despite the nose plugs. Eyes watering as I suppressed my gag reflex, I went back to the door. Now that the door was slightly ajar, it was much easier to move. Apparently, my initial effort had broken the worst of the rust joins. Heaving mightily, I pulled the door the rest of the way open. Light from the yellowish bulb spilled into the small chamber beyond the door. The room was about 5 feet wide and deep, extending out under what would be our backyard. All 6 walls were made of poured concrete, not unlike what made up the rest of the unfinished portion of the basement. The walls were unadorned, and the ceiling was of similar height to the rest of the basement, albeit made of poured concrete rather than floor joists. The floor, however, was mostly not there, being largely taken up by a hole some 4 feet in diameter, like an enormous sump. I saw nothing dead or dying at this level, so I assumed whatever lay dead at the bottom of the... Well, I went into the utility room to grab a sturdy flashlight off the rollaway. I glanced at Domino, still cowering in the family room. "It's just a hole in the ground, boy. Nothing to worry about." However, I did not feel near as confident as I sounded. I walked back to the door and peered into the hole with the flashlight. The hole was deep, very deep. The beam of light shot down through the darkness, reflecting faintly off glistening walls and finely black water, some 100 feet below. The walls were concrete, going down about 20 feet before giving way to closely fitted stones that looked like they could have been pulled from the Arkansas River that ran only a few miles away near downtown. "Damn," I whispered to no one in particular. "Don't see any dead things." "Is it the water itself that stinks? If so, that sucks, as I don't really have a way to drain the damn thing. If that's even possible." I was contemplating my next move when suddenly I was shoved from behind. I barely had time to register a shadowy movement at the periphery before I plunged into the hole, narrowly avoiding smashing my head against the floor of the room. I ricocheted back and forth against the rough walls like a chubby pinball, shredding my shirt and gaining at least one substantial gash along my left triceps before plunging into the icy, oily water so far below. Fortunately, my flashlight was one of those as seen on TV jobs that work under almost any condition. Therefore, it remained on as I tried not to panic and kicked my way to the surface. I floated there, treading water and staring up at the pale circle of light far above. "Help! Help!" I yelled in vain, knowing full well that no one was due home for at least a couple of hours. A few seconds later, my pulse quickened as a shadow appeared at the edge of the circle of dim light. A sharp, quick bark sounded, and I realized the shadow belonged to my dog. How nice, I thought. Poor little guy braved his fears to check on me. "Domino!" I shouted. "Go get help!" Domino's shadow disappeared, and I had a brief flicker of hope. It was, however, quickly dashed when the shadow returned, and 2 seconds later there was a splash next to me. I directed the beam of my flashlight toward the flash, and there, in the cold, greasy water, floated Domino's Kong chew toy. He wanted to play fetch. Unfortunately, I don't have that good of an arm. Time passed, and I wondered how much longer I could tread water. I didn't wear a watch, and my phone lay in the family room on an end table, plugged into the charger. Not that it would have worked after being dunked in the water anyway. Curious, but not displeased, I found that once I was in the water, the smell was significantly diminished. Clearly the fumes created by whatever had died and must still lay at the bottom of the well were rising far enough above the water to no longer bother me. I was getting tired. Treading water for 30 minutes in full clothing when you are as out of shape as I am is ridiculously taxing. So, to alleviate some of the issue, I stripped down to my Fruit of the Loom boxer briefs. As I felt the sodden clothes sink to the floor of the well, I got a renewed sense of vigor. Unfortunately, that didn't help for very long, and about 15 minutes later I was getting very tired again. I had moved to the side of the well and jammed my fingers and toes into the crevices between the stones and hung on, gripping the flashlight in my teeth. Then I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. The slam of the door, some 100 feet above me. More than that, I heard the ominous echoing click of a very heavy lock. I started screaming for help repeatedly, but long after my throat was raw and bloody, there was still no response. The walls of the well began to vibrate beneath my fingertips and toes. Bubbling up through the water came a low grating sound. I felt a tug at my side and turned my head, and therefore the flashlight in my teeth. The water in the well began to spin in a counterclockwise motion. Faster and faster, the water tugged relentlessly on my precarious grip. Finally, I could no longer gave in to the grip of the whirlpool. I gulped a quick breath, losing my flashlight in the process as I sank down through the greasy water, thrashed repeatedly against the rough, damp stone, and soon sucked into a narrow tube of water. I eventually succumbed to the abuse and sank into unconsciousness. I woke coughing and hacking in absolute darkness on cool, wet rock. I rolled to my side and retched up about a gallon of water and cleared the remaining damp from my lungs. My surroundings were eerily quiet, but as I sat there, I began to make out the faint outline of the hand at which I stared. Glancing beyond, in the distance I saw an extremely faint, watery light. My flashlight. Maybe? I staggered to my hands and knees, focused on that faint hope, and began crawling, ignoring the sharp pains in my arthritic joints. I'd managed only a couple of paces when I struck water. It smelled of old stone and rich minerals, but at least it wasn't the greasy, rotting smell of the well. I suddenly realized how thirsty I was, thrust my hands into the cool water, and lapped eagerly. When I had sated my thirst, I managed to stagger to my feet. I felt vulnerable and exposed as I refocused on the light and stumbled toward it through the nearly invisible water. I reached the source of the light in only a few seconds, but it seemed interminable. Fortunately, the water stayed knee-deep or shallower. I bent down and retrieved the flashlight, staring at it numbly as the water dripped from its plastic casing. Feeling new vigor at the thought of being able to see at least a little, I turned the flashlight back the way I'd come. I could just make out the shore of this underground lake. I walked toward dry ground, grateful for the find, but desiring to finally dry out. It was cool in the cavern, but not particularly damp, so I hoped that proceeded rapidly. The cavern I found myself in was huge. My poor flashlight had no hopes of seeing either the ceiling or the far side of the underground lake I found myself beside. On this side of the lake, a mere 15 or so feet from the shoreline, rose the rough wall of my impromptu tomb, extending God only knows how far above me and beyond the reach of my beam, to the left and the right. Perhaps the hollow earth conspiracy theorists knew something after all. I approached the wall and touched a tentative hand to the surface. Dry and even a little chalky. Strange. Laying the flashlight along the wall and pointing the beam to the left, I could just make out a slight inward bend to its trajectory. So at least I knew it didn't go on forever. Although, however, I had no real notion of how big this room might be, and I saw no other exit in sight. Turning around and facing the other direction gave me no further insights. Breathing deeply in and out, I tentatively started out in the direction I now faced. Trailing my left hand along the rough wall and holding the light in my right, I soldiered bravely on. I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing, but I did know that standing still would drive my already high anxiety right around the bend. So I kept walking. I don't really know how long I walked before I found the tunnel opening, but it felt like hours. Nothing about my scenery had changed. The lake still stretched infinitely to my right, and the wall still paced me on my left. Above me, the ceiling approached no nearer. The tunnel was not large. An opening from the floor to the apex of the arch was about 5 feet high. The opening was strangely symmetrical at about 3 feet wide. The floor was the same smooth stone as the chamber. It certainly didn't seem natural, but man-made? Down here? Why? I trained the light down the tunnel and noticed one thing right away. The tunnel angled downward at a significant angle. Great. I didn't really want to go further down into the depths. But I didn't want to keep walking around the strange lake. I had no idea what to do. I heard a splash behind me. I jerked around and shined my light across the water. There was nothing there, not even a ripple across the surface of the lake. A shiver ran up and down my spine and my breath caught in my throat. That decided me. I had to get away from the lake. Turning abruptly, I ducked my head and entered the low tunnel. Fortunately, I'm not very tall, so I only had to stoop a little to avoid scraping my head against the ceiling of the tunnel. The ceiling and walls felt like polished stone and had a color nearing that of obsidian. The floor, however, was a pale gray and had a texture like poured concrete. The path seemed to extend endlessly beyond the limits of my flashlight. It wasn't long before the isolation began to sink in. I could see not destination before me, nor any trace of where I had come from. Only endless tunnel in both directions. Only the persistent pull of gravity reminded me that I was traversing deeper and deeper into the Earth's crust. After about 40 minutes, and at the slow, cautious pace I was traveling, that amounted to maybe a mile, the tunnel leveled out, but continued apparently endlessly into the darkness. In all that time, not a single thing changed about my surroundings except the depth at which I trod. The only sounds were the scraping of my hiking boots against the rough stone. I stopped and took some deep breaths. My heart pounded far faster than my minimal exertion would account for. As I relaxed, my flashlight inadvertently dipped toward the ground, illuminating the expanse of flooring just before me. That's when I saw it. Scrawled on the rough floor in blue chalk was a large numeral 1, large enough that it would have been almost impossible to miss. Did that confirm that I had indeed come a single mile? Did it mean something altogether different? Who had made the mark? When was the mark made? There were too many questions and not enough answers. Would I run into someone else down here that could tell me something? Nothing to do but press on. I was holding my flashlight straight out in front of me, so I was a bit surprised when I stumbled over something lying on the floor a few minutes later. I stopped, of course, and trained my light straight down. A shoe lay there. A small shoe. A child's shoe. With no context, I felt the light fingers of fear dance down my spine. I wanted to turn back right then and run screaming from the tunnel, but then I thought of the mile or more uphill climb and whatever awaited me at the lake. Besides, unless I decided to go back into the water, there was no way out that way. Only slow starvation. Gritting my teeth, I picked up the shoe, and with it in hand, I continued to trace along the wall. I can't tell you why, but I felt it might be important somehow. I moved on even slower than before, playing my light slightly downward, so I would miss nothing else that was lying in my path. Several minutes later, I'd lost all track of time. I came across another chalk drawing. A 2. Someone was counting something. Miles? I didn't care. At least it meant I was moving forward and not just losing my mind. Of course, I could be imagining the numbers, but the reassuring feel of the child's shoe tied to my belt loop made me disregard that train of thought. By this point, I was mostly dry, though my briefs and my hair were still damp. I was getting hungry and foot sore. Walking barefoot on such a rough terrain, while not painful, was wearing. I leaned up against the tunnel wall on my left, taking deep breaths while trying to remain as silent as possible. I wanted to slump down to the ground, but feared that if I did, I would never resume my strange journey. Forcing myself upright, I continued down the dark tunnel. A couple of dozen steps later, I put my left foot down on nothing. Fortunately, I was still trailing my right hand along the tunnel wall, so I quickly caught myself and prevented myself from falling ass over appetite. Heart beating way too fast, I pointed my light toward the ground. I stood at the top of what appeared to be an endless flight of steps going down. As the sound of rushing blood slowly faded from my ears, I began to make out a sound originating far below. An involuntary shudder went through my body. Again, I contemplated going back the way I'd come. This tunnel only leads deeper and deeper into a darkness bereft of any comfort, food, or drink, but nothing helpful lay back there. I couldn't even be 100% sure how I arrived on the shore of the underground lake. Unfortunately, almost the moment I set foot on the stairs, the temperature around me dropped significantly, and I began to violently shiver. My vague recollection of caving tried to remind me that the temperature should stay around 50 degrees. No matter how deep I went, but reality refused to cooperate. As I continued to descend, the light hitting the tunnel walls began to appear to glimmer. At that same moment, I realized that my right hand was trailing through dampness. I was nearly overcome by sudden thirst. I turned to the wall and literally licked the damp stone, over and over. Though it had a high mineral taste, it went a long way toward quenching my thirst. Unfortunately, having quenched my thirst only heightened the pangs of hunger I was beginning to feel. I kept descending, for how long I could not judge, but eventually the stairs came to an end. When it did end, I found myself in a small room of cut stone, maybe 10 feet wide, practically a cube. Opposite the stairs stood a heavy metal door, steel by its dull reflection. I played the light over its surface. It looked like the door to a bank vault, large and heavy with a wheel on the front. There was faded paint across the top of the door. I approached closer. Holding the light at an angle, I could just make out the faded words, Dakota Territory Resource Corps. 7. Beneath the wheel, a black aluminum plate about 12 inches by 6 inches had been fastened by rivets to the steel door. Engraved on the plate was the phrase, "Closed by federal mandate, March 17, 1934. Well, that's interesting, I thought. That predates the building of my house. I played the light around the rest of the room and froze when the light shone on what lay in the corner opposite me and just left of the stairs. The shock of what I saw didn't cause me to drop my flashlight, but I did lose my grip on the child's shoe. I'd found its match. Slumped in the corner was the desiccated corpse of a small child, a toddler perhaps 3 to 4 years old. He was dressed in a way that I can only imagine kids dressed back in the late 30s or early 40s. He had obviously been dead a very long time, but I did wonder what he was doing down here. I approached the body cautiously, and while doing my best to stifle my revulsion, I searched the corpse for anything to explain its presence. I found nothing. I turned the page of the manuscript, but that was it. That was the last page. I looked up and rubbed my eyes. I had been reading for quite a while. So what the hell was this? I looked again at the UPS envelope that the manuscript had come in. No return addresses. Nothing to indicate where the package had come from. Only the date of October 30th, 2018. It wouldn't bother me. I'd expect a prank from one of my friends, but for 2 things. October 30th, 2018 is the same day I moved into my new to me house, and the door under the stairs in the manuscript matches exactly the door in my own basement. What should I do? It's been 3 days since I finished the manuscript. Last night I woke up in the middle of the night to find myself standing in the storage closet under the stairs staring at the locked door. Mind you, I am not known to be a somnambulist. I have no recollection as to how I got from my bed, in the finished part of the basement, to the understairs storage closet. When I woke up, I couldn't move. I've suffered from sleep paralysis in the past, but I've never experienced it standing up. I was frozen like that for 2 hours. The entire time I stood there, I felt, more than heard, an ominous slithering from beyond the portal, punctuated occasionally by a thump as something thick and heavy struck the door. When I finally could move, I rushed upstairs to my office to jump on the computer and update you guys. The clock on my phone read 4:0. I had just logged into Reddit when the doorbell rang. I just sat there. No way in hell I was opening the door at that hour given what I'd just gone through. I did glance between the closed blinds in time to see a brown UPS van pulling away from the curb in front of my house. UPS does not deliver in my neighborhood at 4 in the morning. Call me stupid, but I had to know. Hesitantly, I went to the front door and peered through the small glass window. Seeing nothing, I opened the front door. Another envelope lay wedged between my door and the storm door. It fell over with a soft thud. I picked it up and quickly shut the door. With an eagerness bordering on desperation, I brought it into my office, examining the package as I went. Again, the package was blank, but for a hand-printed date, October 31st, 2018. Back in my office, I tore open the package to find a sheath of 15 or so typewritten pages. These pages were like the last bunch, yellowed with age and stained by faint reddish-brown stains. I sat down on my office balance ball chair and began to read. I made the sign of the cross and did my best to compose the bones in a slightly better state of rest. There wasn't a whole lot more that I could do. I was tired, but I had to press on. Just thinking about the effort it would take to remount those stairs made me shudder. But how was I to proceed? I hadn't tried the door yet, but surely it was locked. Why else would the child have stopped here? It was the only thing that made sense. My jumbled thoughts were a chaos of fear, sadness, and frustration. More than once I wondered if I was already dead and this was my sojourn to hell. Dragging myself away from such morbid thoughts, I went back to the heavy steel door. Gripping the butt of the flashlight between my teeth and placing both hands on the wheel, I tried to make it turn. I almost gave up, but at the last second, it moved. Just a fraction of an inch, but nevertheless, the wheel moved. I took a deep breath, held it, bunched up my muscles, and gave it everything I had. The wheel moved another inch. I fell back panting, my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. Maybe I would keel over from a heart attack and save me the suffering of dying from starvation. I did discover that it is very difficult to gasp for breath with a flashlight clenched in your teeth. When I had regained my composure somewhat, I wiped my sweat-slicked palms on my marginally damp drawers and applied myself once more to the wheel. After 2 more monstrous efforts, the wheel began to turn more freely until finally it came to a stop with a loud metallic scraping and an audible clunk. The sounds were impossible in the previous silence, and I cowered back toward the stairs, afraid of what I don't know. When nothing pounced at me, I once again approached the door. Taking a double-handed grip on the wheel, I heaved backward with everything I had left. The door opened slowly inward with a screech to rival a pissed-off bean sigh. A puff of fetid air washed over me as I managed to create a gap just wide enough through which to squeeze my somewhat stout frame. The darkness was no less complete beyond the vault door, and the beam of my flashlight quickly got swallowed up in the long tunnel in which I found myself. What I stumbled on appeared to be a mine, and that gave me a faint glimmer of hope. A mine could have another potential exit, or at least air shafts, through which I might escape. But then I recalled the colossal door through which I'd just passed, and my hopes faded. Still, it was better to push on. The tunnel I stood in was low, barely 6 feet, but wide, close to 15 feet. Down the center of the tunnel, an ancient iron rail started about 20 feet from the vault door and ran off into the blackness. An old minecart sat at the near end of the track, but it appeared to be rusted in place. Along the wall to my right, a long row of iron pegs had been pounded into the stone. Most, but not all, of the pegs were empty. A few still contained some useful items. The first thing I found was a stiff set of denim coveralls that almost fit. In any case, they helped relieve the chill. I also found an American antique industrial hardened leather turtle coal mining hard hat with a carbide autolite gas lamp. The canister still contained some liquid. Hoping against hope, I struck the flint striker against the tiny metal plate. After a few tries, the burner lit with a clean, bright white light. I had no idea how much carbide was left, but hopefully it would last a while at least. Maybe I could find some refills further on. At least I could save my flashlight battery for a time. I turned it off and dropped it in a deep pocket of the coveralls. Only later did it occur to me that there could have been a buildup of flammable gases in the tunnel, and lighting the lamp risked a catastrophic explosion. The luck of the foolhardy, I suppose. The last item I discovered was a pair of mostly intact boots. They were too big and stiff as hell, but even without socks it beat walking along the rough floor of the tunnel barefoot. The carbide lamp was brighter than my weakening flashlight beam, and I could see nearly 40 feet down the tunnel. Right at the edge of my vision, something lay between the tracks. As I approached it, all the hope I'd garnered from suitably equipping myself drained away even as the blood drained from my visage. The body of a man lay between the tracks in front of me, or rather, half the body of a man. A skeletal torso dressed in the ragged remains of a coverall, not unlike the one I was wearing, lay between the old rails. Its arms outstretched, still gripping the remains of an ancient pickaxe. I checked the hard hat for extra carbide, but it had long since been used up. What disturbed me about the discovery, however, was the fact that the body was completely missing its pelvis and lower legs, the remains of the coveralls being little more than tattered shreds. I couldn't help but think, the way the body was stretched out, that the man had been fleeing something. But what could do that to a man and leave no evidence of the missing bits? I shuddered involuntarily, but had the presence of mind to retrieve what remained of the pickaxe. About 2 feet of dry wooden shaft mounted by the long, curved iron pick. Gaining only marginal comfort from my makeshift weapon, I moved on down the mine shaft. Unfortunately, down seemed the correct indicator, as I could discern a slight angle to the path I walked. That didn't seem to bode well, and every instinct begged me to turn around and run. Still, I thought of what might lay in the subterranean lake and the knowledge that going back guaranteed no means of egress from this nightmare world in which I found myself. I walked long enough for my heels to develop blisters and my body begin to chafe against the rough denim of the coveralls. I passed occasional openings on either side of the main path, but none of them contained tracks and didn't seem particularly promising. I told myself if the cart tracks lead nowhere, I could always make my way back and check the side routes then. But in truth, something drew me toward the deep. Curiosity? Maybe? The promise of a possible way out? Seems unlikely. What then? What drew me deeper and deeper into the darkness? In any case, I kept moving, placing one foot in front of the other until my journey became something of a mechanical thing. I lost track of time as there was little by which to measure it. The side passages appeared at irregular intervals, and the tunnel itself was nearly featureless. I tried counting track ties, but gave up after 500, too tired and hungry to keep track any longer. The hunger drove me to think of rats, and I began to fantasize about catching a large rodent and taking a big bite. At the time, I couldn't imagine what raw rat would taste like, and in fact, the very scarcity of any type of vermin weighed heavily upon my mind. I was not disappointed that I hadn't found any more dead bodies, whole or not. Sometime later, my light, still burning, so it had to be less than 4 hours, reflected off a thin rivulet of liquid coming from a side passage on my left and running into a side passage on my right. It felt like water and didn't smell like anything but rock. I was beyond caring at this point, so I knelt and scooped as much up as I could, taking the time to slake my thirst. The water didn't kill me immediately and helped me regain my wits somewhat. At least enough to realize if the water was flowing from the left, it meant that left was up. As much as the deep was calling me, I couldn't rationally turn from the first upward indicating passage I'd found. Just as I left the main tunnel and began following the trickle of water, I heard what sounded like a cross between the cry of a hawk and the torment of the damned coming from somewhere further down the tunnel. I turned to look, but of course saw nothing within the short range of my hard hat lamp. The sound echoed in the passage and seemed to reverberate for several minutes. Whatever it was certainly enough to spur me to action. I began moving swiftly up the tunnel, going only slow enough as to not extinguish the dancing flame from my lamp. My burst of energy didn't last, however, when I heard no indication of pursuit. I was running off pitiful amounts of water and stored adipose tissue. My feet cried out in agony, and my hands were raw from multiple tumbles I took in the surprisingly varied terrain. After a very short time, the dugout mine tunnel quickly became a much more natural cavern-like structure, often growing narrower with much rougher passage. There were several times I had to chimney up, near vertical shafts, in my continued search for the source of my drinking water. After one such arduous climb, I dropped heavily in a mostly horizontal part of the tunnel. As I did so, the flame of my carbide lamp died out, and no amount of striking would get it lit again. I wanted to retrieve my flashlight and keep going, but my heart wasn't in it. Instead, I sat in complete darkness for a while. No sound but the faint rush of the tiny stream and my own breathing. Eventually, weariness overtook me, and I drifted into unconsciousness. There was a dark, frantic chaos to my dreams. I fled through endless tunnels from a creature I could not see, though I could hear it whispering to me, "Come to the heart, join with the brethren." The same nonsensical phrase, repeatedly as I fled in darkness. When I awoke, I did not know where I was. For several minutes, I did not even know I was awake. So complete was the darkness. I could not tell whether my eyes were even open. I could not understand why my clothing felt so stiff and why my feet hurt. As ignorance slowly succumbed to memory, I groped in the deep pocket for my flashlight. As I closed my hand around its reassuring form, a new sound entered my awareness. The sound of breathing other than my own. I caught my breath, too terrified to move. The rhythmic sound went on from somewhere back the way I'd come. Either something else was tracing the water to its source, or something was following me. Whatever it was didn't seem to be moving, just breathing. I was at a loss as to what to do. I'd lost my hold on the pickaxe sometime as I slept, and I was afraid to move too much for fear of alerting whatever stalked me to my presence. Slowly, ever so slowly, I began to feel around in the direction in which I thought I'd left the pick. Unfortunately, I misjudged the distance, and instead of retrieving the tool quietly, I managed to bump it and send it clattering to the ground. Once again I froze as I realized the breathing had stopped. What replaced it was the unmistakable sound of claws scrabbling over stone somewhere below me. Only then did I remember that I'd just exited a nearly vertical shaft, and by a trick of acoustics, whatever stalked me sounded much closer than it was. Heartened by this possibility, I quickly pulled the flashlight free, flicked it on, retrieved the pick, and began to make my way as quickly as I could in the opposite direction from my pursuer. Immediately, the scrabbling sound behind and below me grew louder, and I realized I was in a flight for my life. I plunged headlong through the tunnel, often doing more crawling and climbing than running, and still my pursuer seemed mere feet behind me. I did not look back for fear that seeing the creature would paralyze me with fear, and surely be the end of me. Yet always I heard it scraping and panting, and moreover, I felt it looming just behind me in the impossible blackness. Ahead of me, the sound of rushing water grew louder and louder until it drowned out all other sounds. I couldn't hear myself breathe. I couldn't hear myself think. I certainly could no longer hear the creature chasing me. Oh, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence stronger than ever. Oh, so close behind me. Suddenly, I stumbled out of the narrow passageway and into a larger chamber. I splashed in the water, covering the floor ankle deep, and my flashlight shone on the source of the stream. A torrent of water poured out a narrow fissure some 20 or so feet away, draining not only out through the passage I'd followed from the mine, but also through many narrower openings far too small to allow me to pass. The sound of the rushing water in the small chamber was deafening, and I knew that I had reached the end of the line. I whipped gracelessly around to face my tormentor, pickaxe in one hand and flashlight in the other. I caught just a hint of a looming dark shadow when my flashlight failed me. Plunged into absolute darkness, I screamed and held out the pick in a useless defense, awaiting the inevitable pain. The horrible scream came again, only this time only inches from my face, and I swore I saw two glowing red eyes. I looked up from the manuscript. Something was scratching at my office door. I froze. I lived alone, and I didn't have any pets. Slowly, I stood up and made my way to the door, telling myself that I was just caught up in the mysterious narrative, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, the sound persisted. When I reached the door, I yanked it open with sudden force, hoping to surprise whatever was making the sound. Instead, I was surprised to see a small, black cat with white paws sitting calmly in the doorway, licking a paw that had been most recently creating new furrows in my office door. I laughed. "Where the hell did you come from?" The cat said nothing, just quietly pattered across the floor and jumped up onto my desk and lay down next to my laptop. As my heart rate returned to something akin to normal, I went into the kitchen and poured some milk into a bowl. Cats like milk, right? This one did anyway, because when I set it on the desk, far away from my computer, The cat got up, sauntered over to the bowl like it owned the place, and began lapping loudly. I returned to my balance ball and picked up the manuscript once again. Death did not come for me in that moment. No, instead I swooned. At least I think I did. Next thing I knew, I was lying in the shallow pool of water, once again getting soaking wet. I'd lost the flashlight somewhere, but I somehow managed to retain my grip on the pick. Of course, I could see nothing, and the rush of water drowned out any other sounds. And what of my pursuer? I heard nothing. Sensed nothing. What in God's name had happened? Had I imagined it all? No, impossible. I'm not crazy. I'm not. That's when I noticed the stinging sensation on my cheek. I sat up and touched my face. I felt the raised welt of a fresh scratch about 2 inches long and deep enough to leave a scar. It was damp, but whether with water or blood was impossible to say. It didn't feel sticky, but would it? I stood up slowly. The room seemed to no longer hold any threat, but I had no idea what to do next. I could stay in the room. I would have plenty of water. But even I couldn't live off my own body fat for very long. Although I have heard that people have been known to fast for days, even weeks at a time. Didn't Gandhi once fast for 21 days? However, I didn't relish sitting around in the dark in a damp cave for a couple of weeks hoping for what? Rescue? Unlikely. What other choices did I have? I could return the way I had come through the narrow passage and make my way back to the mine. Continue along the tracks. Hope to reach another exit. But what if my stalker lurked just beyond this chamber? Maybe it didn't like the water and was waiting for me to leave the relative safety of the pool? Besides, what would I do when I left my source of water behind? How quickly does a person succumb to thirst? I was literally up a creek without a paddle. In the end, I left the chamber. The same impetus that drove me from the subterranean lake drove me from the water chamber. If I was moving forward, I could still hope for a positive outcome. The going would be painfully slow, but at least I'd stay near a source of water for quite a while. I didn't relish making my way in the dark, but I couldn't find my flashlight, and the headlamp had long since given up the ghost. I upended the hard hat and used it as a makeshift bucket to carry about half a gallon of water. It wasn't great, but it was something. Fortunately, I didn't run into my stalker in the passage beyond the water chamber. He, she, or it was gone, seemingly without a trace. It took me hours to retrace my steps to the main tunnel of the mine. At least I assume it took hours. Traveling through impenetrable darkness totally eradicated any concept of the passage of time. I slept when I got tired and moved on when I woke. I was continually plagued by horrific nightmares, but my strange tormentor never returned. It took me 4 sleeps to reach the main tunnel of the mine. I was hungry and tired and notably thinner. When I finally tripped over the iron cart rails, I sat down and had a good, long cry. I couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity for very long, for doing that would just lend to slowly starving to death. Fortunately, I had the tracks to guide me. Otherwise, I would have been completely disoriented in the absolute darkness. As it was, it took me a few minutes to determine which way lead deeper into the mine, but gravity helped me out there, even if it was only slight. Walking slowly, I began to move out into the darkness. The process was slow. I kept tripping over the track ties and had to catch myself several times to prevent myself from face diving. I walked forward with the pickaxe held out in front of me, occasionally swinging it back and forth just in case something lurked before me. I gave no thought as to what might lay behind me. There are only so many fears a body can face at one time. After a time, the head of the swinging pick rang out against something metallic. I froze up, letting the echoes fade. When the eerie silence returned, I let the pick drop to my side and reached out with a bare hand, moving slowly forward. My imagination ran wild as my hands slowly tried to discover what sat on the tracks before me. What I discovered was another minecart, Only this one did not seem to be rusted in place. When I found and released the brake, the cart tried to move forward. I reapplied the brake and felt around inside the cart. Almost immediately, my questing hands located the miner, or rather, what was left of him. The skeletal figure was sitting slumped over in the cart. From what I could tell, he was still wearing most of a set of coveralls and, more important, a hard hat. He was, however, missing one leg and one arm. I did not relish thinking about whatever had killed these miners, and my mind flashed back to the closure notice that had been placed on the vault door. More importantly, the hard hat had a carbide lantern that still contained a bit of calcium carbide. I added water from my hard hat to the water chamber and tried the striker. After several failed attempts, the flame flared up, and fortunately, I wasn't looking directly at it. As it was, my eyes ran with tears as they tried to adjust to the sudden light. When I could finally see again, I peered into the minecart. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At the foot of the bones of the long-dead miner were gathered supplies for survival. Was this man bringing aid to fellows further down in the mine? Would I ever know? Did it matter? First things first, I took the dead miner's hard hat for my own. I could now see quite well with the light from the carbide lamp. What's more, this fine fellow had a canteen. It was empty, but I carefully poured what water was left in my own hard hat into the canteen. If I was lucky, I'd find more water along the way. Kansas has a notoriously high water table, so surely more would leak through somewhere. In a tin pail, I found something akin to food. There was a tin of sardines and a pouch of nameless dried meat. I devoured both quickly, not caring what illness might occur later, and shook with the relief it brought. The final treasure was the 5 unopened cans of calcium carbide in the bottom of the cart. They seemed intact and undamaged, so I pocketed them in various locations on my filthy coveralls. That's when I got the brilliant idea to use the cart for transportation. I may have been going a bit mad at this point. Working by the light of my new headlamp, I dragged the poor miner from the cart and laid him out as neatly as possible beside the tracks. I made the sign of the cross and whispered a quick Hail Mary. I also removed a rotting package of what I hoped was old fruit or vegetables. With the cart now empty, I climbed in carefully and settled down, facing deeper into the mine. I reached out for the handbrake and carefully released the mechanism. With the uncomfortably loud screech of long unused axles, the cart began to roll slowly forward. Gravity slowly began to take hold. The incline of the mine tunnel was not great at this point, but by increments, I began to pick up a little speed, but nothing alarming. Despite the rough ride, the rocking motion of the minecart eventually lulled me to sleep. I woke to a breeze of motion chilling my face. I rolled along a decent clip, but the tunnel remained unchanged. I could not tell how far I'd come. My lamp still burned, so it couldn't have been long. The light was playing tricks on my eyes because the beam wasn't disappearing into the distance the way it should. That's when I realized I was approaching a wall. Before I could think to apply the handbrake, the bottom dropped out. The mine shaft took a deep dive. What I had been seeing in front of me was the ceiling of the tunnel, as it radically changed directions. The cart picked up speed rapidly, and I squeezed my eyes shut, but the darkness was worse than the stone walls and low ceiling hurtling by. I gripped the edges of the cart with both hands as my stomach and its recent contents leaped into my throat. The contents didn't stay there, and I was soon spewing my meager meal over the side of the cart. It didn't last long, but the dry heaves lasted longer. Mere seconds later, the tunnel leveled again, but my speed barely diminished. I needed to apply the brake, but I was weak from my ordeal and recent vomiting. At least my stomach started to settle. The wind of my descent had blown out the lamp, and I was hurtling along in absolute darkness. I grit my teeth, determined to try to apply the brake and slow my headlong blind journey. As I reached out toward the handle, the echoes changed, and I could sense a vast empty space all around me. I nearly panicked then as the cart rolled on, the echoes of my passing changing dramatically. I missed the handle twice as I reached in the darkness. But on the third time, I gripped it tight and hauled backward. With squeals and sparks and strain on my bicep, the cart screeched to a halt, and in the silence, rocked gently back and forth. I lit the lamp on my hard hat. The carbide and water both needed replenished, and I thanked nameless gods that I'd found the spare containers. With light once more returned, I took in my surroundings. The light from my lamp, despite its enduring brightness, became swallowed in the vast darkness that surrounded my precarious perch. And precarious indeed was my perch. The cart balanced atop a high trestle of creaking wood that spanned an indeterminate gulf. I could see neither any wall nor floor or ceiling. Every slight sound of movement echoed ominously, and there was more. Deep below me, something rumbled in the darkness, crying out in eldritch agony. Every time it did, the entire trestle trembled. Looking down, I fancied I saw movement. Something sinuous but enormous. Something lurking just beyond the reach of my vision. I shivered involuntarily. Whatever lay in the chamber below was maddened by pain and sorrow, and I felt its anger rising through the darkness, but nothing more stirred. Shakily, I released the brake and let gravity once again begin pulling the mining cart across the trembling trestle bridge. I kept staring into the darkness below, willing the malevolent presence to maintain its peace. For reasons I cannot begin to understand, no molestation came. No monstrous malignancy rose up to devour me as I passed beyond the monstrous cavern and once more into a regular passage. I wept with relief as I rolled at a much more sedate pace deeper into the mine. I had survived something. What? I did not know. At the time, I had no idea how naive and temporary my respite would be. That was it. That was the end of the second installment. What was this? Where had this manuscript come from? I looked at the clock on my phone. 6:0. Time to shower and get ready for work. But I couldn't move. I'm not sure why, but my anxiety was suddenly through the roof. I wanted, no needed, to know the fate of the author of the manuscript and why I was receiving his words. He'd mentioned Kansas, and that's where I live. Was he really writing about an abandoned mine under my house? I felt a powerful urge to break into the door in my basement. At the same time, a sense of fear and loathing overcame me as I felt, somewhere deep below where I sat, the palpable malice described by the author of the strange papers I had been receiving. What would I do if I never heard the end of the story? I felt the edges of madness just beyond my periphery. An impatient meow interrupted my revelry and snapped me out the bizarre melancholy that threatened to overtake my thoughts. The milk bowl was empty, and the cat was demanding more. I had totally blocked out its presence, so absorbed had I been by what I'd been reading. The cat followed me into the kitchen while I fetched a tin of tuna from the corner cabinet. I set the bowl down on the floor, and the cat went to town. I'm back at my laptop now, getting ready to upload this latest. If anybody has any information about mining operations in Kansas the beginning of the last century, please point me in the right direction. I can't seem to find anything. At least Google isn't very promising. Okay, I must stop or I'll be late for work. It is becoming difficult to maintain the facade of normality. Every day I struggle to get through work. Half the time I spend looking out my window, hoping to see the familiar brown truck. When I am at home, I fear for the presence that lurks below, but I am compelled to remain in the house. I have not been beyond my mailbox in 4 days. I don't bathe, I barely eat, I work just enough to keep my job. I fear madness has overtaken me, and I know not what to do. My sleep, what little I manage to get, is plagued by nightmares. I am chased by vague, shadowy, sinuous things of enormous influence and power. 3 times I have awakened to find myself standing before the basement door. The last time I found myself with a hand on the old lock. Tonight, I will tie my ankle to the bedpost, lest I wander too far. I should probably see a specialist, but I find I cannot leave the house. I'm posting again because this morning, when I came up from my bedroom, I found a 3rd package. This one on my kitchen table. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it, and I rushed to the front door to see if I had been broken into, but it remained securely locked. Again, the package was marked with nothing more than a typewritten date, November 1st, 2018. My hand trembled to touch the envelope. Desperately, I wanted both to rip open the packaging and begin reading the pages and at the same time pick up the thing with a pair of tongs and toss it into the trash. Unfortunately, it was not the wiser self that prevailed, and I had soon retired to the couch, the open envelope clutched in sweaty palms. Reverently, I withdrew the sheath of typewritten pages and placed them carefully on the coffee table in front of me. Something new this time. The edges appeared to be burnt, blackened by some unknown fire, though the words could still be made out. How desperate I wanted to know the narrator's fate. How loath I was to begin to read. As soon as my eyes resolved the ink swirls on the page as letters and then words, a dark whispering began behind my left ear as if some spirit had given the writer an audible voice. The mining cart rolled to a stop as I reached the end of the main tunnel. Here, a large space had been hewed from the rock and real mining operation had taken place. I scanned the area strewn with discarded mining equipment. Bodies and parts of bodies lay everywhere I looked. Something had torn these miners to pieces. It was as if there had been explosion, yet there were no signs of any kind of fire damage. Plenty of blunt force trauma, however. Broken equipment lay around the area, mixed up with the skeletal, desiccated corpses. I extricated myself from the mining cart after applying the brake to make sure it didn't roll out from under me. I shined the light back the way I'd come, shivering, although it wasn't that cold in this area. I could sense a palpable darkness back there, ancient and malevolent, in terrible agony. My head pounded with its presence. I pushed thoughts of it aside to better examine my surroundings. Whatever had torn this place apart had done a thorough job. Not much remained whole in the area, including the dead. There were pieces of bone, metal, wood, and rock everywhere. Among the debris, a glint of gold. At least I knew what they had been after down here. Shadows kept moving, just at the periphery of my vision. Formless shades that disappeared as soon as I turned to confront them. I felt dizzy, and I was sweating inexplicably despite the chill in the air. It was the onset of a panic attack, and I was powerless to stop it. I lay down in a relatively clear area of floor and let my world spin around me. I closed my eyes tight to shut out the flickering shadows. How strange that I now embraced the darkness when seemingly mere moments ago I abhorred its smothering grasp. I'm not sure how long I lay there, but eventually I was able to bury the anxiety deep in a walled-off compartment of my fragile psyche. I opened my eyes and slowly sat up. The carbide lamp still burned above the brim of my hard hat. The phantoms were gone, or at least quiescent for now. The presence had retreated to some distant hole, and the pressure within my skull was a mere whimper. I stood up to better investigate my surroundings. I was not, as I had presumed, at a dead end at all. No less than 6 tunnels exited this one large chamber, including the route back the way I'd come. Perhaps I could leave this horrible place without once more venturing into the gaping void across that impossibly narrow bridge. I searched the rubble and the dead to better equip myself for the unknown journey ahead. I located a pickaxe in far better shape than the one I'd been carrying, as well as a stout leather satchel that I filled with the extra calcium carbonate and slung over my shoulder. My feet still chafed in the ill-fitting boots, but I wasn't about to pull rotting socks from the feet of corpses. The first tunnel I picked, the one directly opposite the tracks, went only a short distance before ending in a small chamber lined with metal shelving, spotted with rust and covered in a fine coat of rock dust. The shelves contained supplies for the crews that worked down here back in the day. There wasn't a lot to be had, but I did manage to come up with a pair of boots that fit better than the first pair I'd found, as well as a mostly intact cotton shirt. Then I discovered the wooden crate, oiled and sealed with wax. I pulled it from the shelf and set it on the floor, prying off the lid with my newly acquired pick. I couldn't believe what I'd found and nearly wept for joy. Packed inside the crate were a dozen parcels wrapped in wax paper. I lifted one up and tore open the packaging in eager anticipation. It was, as I'd hoped, a bundle of hardtack. I looked around frantically, hoping against hope, and there it was. Tucked between two of the metal shelves that came together in the corner stood a 55-gallon steel drum. It had a hole in the top, sealed with a wax cork and a spigot about 6 inches from the bottom. I pried loose the cork and turned the spigot. I nearly jumped for joy and shouted hallelujah as the tepid metallic water splashed to the floor. I turned the spigot off long enough to place the canteen beneath it. I filled the canteen twice and emptied it twice before I could stop drinking. I then filled a small tin with water and soaked some hardtack biscuits. When they had softened sufficiently, I wolfed them down. Maybe it seems like a meager meal, but to me it was a feast. When I had finished and I realized that I wasn't going to vomit everything back up, I filled my satchel with parcels of hardtack and filled the canteen a third time. It was time to explore the rest of my surroundings, and for the first time, I felt a small glimmer of optimism. Optimism, as it turns out, is not something that can be easily sustained when you are wandering around in semi-darkness at an unknown depth, in a mind that history has forgotten. I had turned right, out of the storage chamber, and then right again in the very next passageway. This tunnel was narrower, only about 8 feet wide. Its left-hand length was marked by a meandering deep scar, as if the miners had followed a vein of ore as it plunged further into the darkness. While there seemed to be some variation in the elevation of this tunnel, it remained, for the most part, at the same level as the mine track terminus. I began to wonder, the further I traveled, what had become of this seemingly rich vein, as I had seen scant traces of it earlier. 30 minutes later, I had at least a partial answer. The tunnel ended in another chamber hewn roughly from the bedrock of this mine. 4 wooden carts, the kind you might hitch to a small pony or donkey, stood along the far wall of this room. Each was piled high with rock and not an insignificant amount of the coveted yellow metal. A 5th cart lay shattered near the center of the chamber. Around it lay the skeletal remains of 3 more miners that were intact. Surprisingly, very little gold material lay in the broken remains of the cart, almost entirely rock. Where had the gold gone? There is something intrinsically depressing about growing inured to the bodies of the dead. After observing so many skeletal remains, however, there is only so much shock to which a body will react. I knelt among the remains of the cart, digging through the stone, trying to find traces of the gold in quantities that matched the other 4 carts. I could find almost none. That's when I noticed a pattern in the remaining rocks. Several large pieces were broken apart, containing cavities on either side of the breaks, and what looked like, of all things, teeth marks. A cold shiver ran down my spine, lifting the hackles on the back of my neck. My gut leapt to conclusions I couldn't wrap my beleaguered mind around. Something had chewed these rocks like an ogre crunching bones, sucking out the golden marrow. That is why there were few traces of the valuable ore in this pile from the broken cart. But that's impossible, right? What manner of creature eats gold? Why? That's when the waves of terror hit me in the back of the head like a brick wrapped in marshmallow. I stumble forward with the psychic impact of the blow. Like a tether of open thought, I could trace great fear and agony back up the corridor through which I'd come. A single thought accompanied the tenuous grasp. Come. My stomach clenched violently, and I immediately spewed yellow bile with water and a bit of the half-digested hardtack. Gasping for breath, I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. What the actual fuck was that? My mind recoiled as the bond between me and whatever lay in such pain snapped. That is when I recognized the nature of the pain. Hunger. Incredible, unbearable agony, inducing hunger. I looked up from the pages I'd been reading. My head was pounding like a mother, and I was hungry as hell. Practically trembling, I set the pages down and got up and went to the kitchen. I made myself a sandwich and ate half it before I left the kitchen. I grabbed a Diet Coke and some BBK chips and went back into the living room, sitting behind the coffee table on which I'd left the manuscript. As I reached for the manuscript, I heard a faint but rhythmic thumping. I froze in mid-reach. What was that? I cocked my head to listen. Was that coming from the basement? Slowly, I got up and went to the basement stairs. Though still faint, the sound was louder here, coming from directly below, my heart beating rapidly and my breath coming in shallow gasps. I hesitantly walked down the stairs. As I crossed the basement floor, I moved slowly so that the sounds of my passing would not drown out the soft, but rapidly getting louder, thumping noises. As soon as I entered the utility room, I knew where the sounds were coming from. I walked to the storage room under the stairs and opened the door. The sounds were immediately louder. It was more than just a rhythmic thumping, too. First, there was a reverberating wet thump of something heavy, striking a wooden surface. Second, a rough, slimy, slithering sound. Finally, a second, much duller thump. Then there was a second's pause before the cycle started again. The light filtering past my body from the utility room into the storage closet did not reach the door I knew to be at the far end, but I was hesitant to draw on the chain that controlled the bulb that would illuminate the interior. Let's face it, I was terrified by the thought of what I might see. Steeling my nerves, I quickly yanked on the chain, prepared for the worst. There was nothing. Nothing, that is, except the continued thump, drag, thump. Unable to stop myself, I entered the storage closet and approached the door. Without thinking, I reached out and grasped the handle. Of course, the heavy padlock was still in place, so the door didn't move, but I jerked my hand away as if I'd been shocked. What was I thinking? Did I really want to know what was making the rhythmic sounds? Suddenly, a crash sounded upstairs, and I bolted from the basement to investigate, leaving the problem of the strange door alone for now. Fortunately, the only problem I found upstairs was a damp cat and a knocked-over water glass. I sighed, picked up the glass, scolded the cat, and found a towel to clean up the mess. Fortunately, the glass wasn't near the manuscript, so it remained no more damaged than it had already been. My eyes were immediately drawn to the typed pages again, so I picked up the manuscript and began reading from where I'd left off. I staggered back up the tunnel to the main mind chamber. The entity was quiescent now, and I was able to put a couple of thoughts together. I sat down hard in the center of the chamber. Why was I so exhausted? Would that thing seek me out again? And what of the missing gold? Consumed? By what? Too many questions and not enough answers, and still no closer to escaping being buried alive. I busied myself making order of the chamber. I dragged all the bodies and parts of bodies back to what I thought of as the gold chamber, and stacked them as neatly and respectfully as possible. I thought I should probably say some reverent words, but my mind was still reeling from my previous ordeal, and no words would come. Instead, I made my way back to the center chamber, sat down against the rough stone wall and ate some more hardtack and drank a little water. It didn't take long for loneliness and despair to take a firm grip on my soul, and I knew if I didn't get up and at least make some effort to continue my explorations, I would give up entirely. I wearily got back to my feet. 3 more openings lead out of this central chamber, so I decided to explore the opening on the other side of the storeroom from the gold chamber. This narrow tunnel leads sharply down into darkness, and seemed to follow no set vein of precious metal. The descent was steep enough that there were occasional steps cut roughly into the floor of the tunnel. In only about 10 minutes, I felt like I had descended at least 100 feet, and the tunnel showed no signs of ending anytime soon. That's when I felt the first tremor. The tremor was weak and distant. It seemed to originate far below and behind me. Nevertheless, I had to catch myself against the wall of the corridor to prevent myself from stumbling. Kansas was not known for earthquakes, although it is true that an ancient fault line did run through Wichita. I only briefly concerned myself, however, chalking the tremor up to possible fracking in Oklahoma. After checking the fuel level in my headlamp, I continued into the depths. After a time, The tunnel leveled out and continued in this manner for several hundred feet. Then the tunnel abruptly ended. Nothing special marked the terminus. It was as if the miners just quit. The only thing that marked this place was a single broken pickaxe, seemingly carelessly abandoned. I sat down in the end of the tunnel, worn out beyond reckoning and disparaged to find yet another dead end. I let my thoughts drift, extinguishing the light to surround myself with absolute darkness. Why dig all this way down and then just stop? Nothing made sense. I felt the edges of madness creeping up from the pitch. I was gonna die here. Of that I was convinced. As I gave up to exhaustion and hopelessness, a whispering impulse infringed upon my thoughts. Must have food. The thought was not my own and was accompanied by another distant tremor. I opened my eyes wide in the blackness. Had I drifted into the realm of sleep while I rested? I strained my ears, but the silence was paramount. Then a thought came again, hunger. The thought was distant and weak, but seemed to be growing stronger. Get out of my head! I shouted into the void. Nothing was there, I knew that, but I lit the lamp again anyway to allay my fears. As I suspected, there was nothing in the tunnel with me but my own thoughts, and yet there was a presence, somewhere, a hungry presence that would soon need to feed. And I had nowhere to go but back to the central chamber. As I began the long climb back, the presence I'd sensed refused to leave me. It found a place in my thoughts and began to make itself comfortable. The thing itself wasn't comfortable, however. It was hungry, and it would need to move soon to find food. I sensed its distress, and its distress became my own. As it needed to move, so then did I. So I climbed faster. My legs were noodles when I finally made it back, and I collapsed to the ground. The foreign thoughts wanted to push me further, back up the tunnel with the rails, but my body had other ideas. My head swimming, I curled into a fetal position and let the forgetfulness of sleep win the day. While I slept, I dreamed. Hunger drove me from my long quiescence. Long had it been since I had fed on the precious yellow minerals that I craved. Long had it been since I feasted on the succulent flesh of the organics that trampled and desecrated my world. I had slept too long, and the hunger had weakened me. That was a condition that must be rectified as soon as possible. Tentatively, I reached out a long, dormant appendage, seeking the precious metal. None lay near. I had leached all nutrients near my lair long ago. But I knew where more lay. Far, but not out of reach. Like the serpents ancient and immortal, I formed a sensory organ at the terminus of my appendage and stretched into the darkness, increasing my awareness of my surroundings. Ignoring the flitting shadows of expired organics, I wind my way out of the depths and tentatively caress the ancient rotting artificial metallic structure left by organics devoured such a short time ago. Reaching the summit, I move forward through the tunnels toward the source of my desire. I pass by a sleeping organic, briefly forming a dripping maw in my temptation to devour, but my hunger for the precious yellow metal drives me on. Down one of the narrow tunnels, I plunge my awareness. Finally, find the conveniently placed compartments of my precious need. I open my dripping maw, newly formed, wide, and begin to feed. I woke suddenly in darkness, heart pounding rapidly and sweat drenching my brow. I lay still, sensing a presence mere inches away. I backed away slowly, fearing to disturb what lay nearby in the darkness. When I felt the security of the rough stone wall behind me, I fumbled for my hard hat light, shakily igniting the bright flame. There, stretching from the entrance chamber to the first tunnel I had searched, lay a large, sinuous, fleshy body, a mottled mix of unnatural colors that seemed to pulse and swirl as I watched. My gut clenched in sudden fear. What great behemoth lay before me? What had I dreamed of? Was it after the gold? Did I dream the truth? I shivered and backed slowly into the only tunnel I'd yet explored, that lay on this side of the cyclopean tentacular body that stretched across the chamber. The whole room vibrated with the rhythmic pulsing of the awful creature. When I felt sufficiently concealed within the side tunnel, I turned and ran. You would probably think it foolish that I ran into a blind tunnel with only the carbide lantern to guide me, but I was consumed by a horrible terror of familiarity. I plummeted along the relatively level, if narrow, tunnel, not much paying attention to my surroundings. After several heart-pounding moments of terror, I realized that my environment had changed significantly. I slowed to a walk just to take it in. Terror changed to shock and awe at the radical change in my environment. I was no longer walking through a tunnel of natural stone. Sometime during my headlong flight, the tunnel had become a concrete corridor, and even 10 feet wide, whose ceiling was lined with old iron pipes and what might have been electrical lines covered by braided cloth insulation. Occasionally, in the center of the ceiling, some 12 feet above me, dangled a bare light bulb from an old cord, none of which were lit. What the actual fuck? What was this? This was not typical underground. It wasn't modern, but it didn't seem as old as the mine itself. It seemed endless, but I kept walking to distance myself from that thing. I felt a distant tremor and wondered what that meant. What was waking? What had I disturbed? I stopped and leaned against the wall, waiting for the tremor to pass. I absently focused on the nearest dangling bulb as it slowly swayed back and forth. When it passed, I continued. At least this was a semblance of civilization. Maybe finally I'd find a way out of this waking nightmare. After a long walk, my heart rate finally returned to normal, and I felt slightly less terrorized as nothing seemed to be pursuing me down the long corridor. Other than the occasional bulb and the rusting pipes, the corridor was featureless. My eyes strained in the darkness beyond my lamp to find some means of egress. I would settle for a freaking door, but I longed for a stair leading to the surface, or better yet, an elevator. After a few more minutes, the long hallway finally ended. At the end of the hall stood a heavy metal door, split down the center with heavy handles on either side, and hinges that indicated it opened inwards toward me. Written in large block letters across both doors was the single word, administration. I pulled on one of the handles experimentally and was surprised to find that despite being quite heavy, the door pulled slowly open. Stepping through the door was like walking from a 1920s miner's enclave into an office building from the 1940s. Swinging my head to the right, I saw a bank of switches. Holding my breath, I switched them all to the up position. A long door-lined corridor sprang up before me, lit by emerald green, upturned wall sconces placed every so often. I stood there, flabbergasted for a bit, shocked by the fact that there was functioning electricity down here, so far below the surface of the earth. Did this mean I could find a way out of this nightmare? As I stopped to contemplate the situation, the world around me started trembling. The shaking started mild, but began to crescendo until I could no longer keep my feet as I was thrown about and then to the floor. Before it subsided, multiple tiles had torn from the walls and several of the glass sconces had shattered. Fortunately, the lights still burned as I slowly recovered. There was no denying it now. Something was quaking the earth down here, and it seemed to be escalating. Was it building to the big one, or were these just aftershocks of the first one I had experienced in the mine? Whatever the case, I knew I had to get out of here soon. I staggered to my feet and started stumbling down the hallway, looking for any means of egress. I tried the doors as I went along, and every door I tried was locked. But the ones with windows showed what appeared to be nondescript, dark offices. None of them appeared to be a way out, though. As I walked, I calmed enough to think about my family far above. I wondered if Shelley had reported me missing. After all, it seemed like it had been days since the well. What of the kids? The pets? Perhaps it was vanity, but what would they do if I never made it back? What would I do? I finally found an unlocked door on the left side of the hall and opened it. I gave up worrying about the future and focused once again on the circumstance at hand. A light switch to the left of the door bathed the room in bright yellow light from two large floor lamps, one which lay prostrate, its glass shade shattered, and the other leaning precariously against a bookshelf. The office was in shambles. The recent quakes had done a job on the place. I set the first lamp upright. Its bulb had already begun to smolder against the coarse brown carpet. The other lamp I simply stabilized. The large black oak desk remained upright, but the drawers had all come out and their contents strewn across the floor. Several books and what appeared to be ledgers had fallen out of the bookshelf behind the desk. There were two other items of the room that immediately sparked my interest. One was an old IBM electric typewriter. The second was a weird tube-like structure along the wall. It looked vaguely familiar, but it took me a minute. Finally, it dawned on me. It looked like the pneumatic tubes at my local bank, although much more ornate and made of glass and copper instead of the familiar plastic. Before touching anything else, I approached the message tube. The slot stood open with the carriage in place. Next to the tube there were two buttons, send and call. My heart started thumping hard in my chest. Would it work? Where did it go? Dare I hope it went to the surface? I searched frantically for a scrap of paper and an ink pen. Finding both, I scratched out one frantic word, help, help. I jammed the paper into the carriage, slid the chamber shut, and pushed hard on the send button. I held my breath, willing something to happen. Then, with a sudden swoop, the carriage rose along the tube and disappeared into the ceiling. Unexpected tears of joy sprang to my eyes. I stood there for a long time, waiting for a response. Nothing came. 10 minutes passed while I stood there, staring at the glass tube. Still, nothing happened. I frowned but busied myself cleaning up the office, all the while thinking that another tremor would destroy the place again. I dumped various office supplies into the drawers and shoved the drawers back into the desk. I righted the leather-backed office chair. I put the books back on the shelves in no order. I even placed the typewriter in the center of the desk pad and fed a blank piece of paper into it, thinking back to my days in typing class back in the 80s. I paced back and forth in the small space the office supplied, glancing every few seconds toward the message tube, hoping something would be there. And still, there was nothing. I was afraid to push the call button for fear of bringing the tube back before it had a chance to be delivered. I opened the door and paced up and down the hallway. I quickly discovered that none of the other doors were unlocked. Coincidence? Fate? The whole thing was feeling more and more like a fever dream. While I paced, I rode through another tremor. This was stronger and lasted longer than any previously. Things were escalating. But what things? I jogged back to what I had started to think of as my office and surveyed the damage. It wasn't too bad, and I quickly straightened the place up again. A surreptitious glance at the message tube revealed an empty chamber. I left the office and went back to my pacing. Eventually, I reached the end of the hallway and, of all things, an elevator. The doors were slightly ajar, which didn't bode well, and neither the up or down buttons lit when I punched them. I did not hold out much hope that a working elevator remained in this place. As no elevator arrived, I levered open the doors. It took more effort than I really wanted to expend, but I finally got them open wide enough to look in. A short distance below where I stood, in the light of my headlamp, lay the bottom of the elevator shaft. Looking above, my light faded into darkness with no sign of the elevator car at all. Directly across from me, an old metal ladder climbed the back wall. That was certainly not a route I wanted to test anytime soon, but if it led to a way out, I sighed, cracked my neck, and headed back to my office. My breath caught as I entered the room, instinctively looking toward the message tube. The carriage had returned. More than that, a new piece of paper lay in the chamber. I practically crossed the room in a single stride, threw open the chamber and the carriage, and unfolded a neatly folded piece of paper. My eyes widened as I read its contents. In the upper left-hand corner of the page was a stamped seal, beneath which read, "In reply, please refer to file no." But, across the top were the words United States Department of Justice. Just below that were the additional words Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the upper right-hand corner, it read Washington 25D. C. And below that, a date of October 30th, 2018. Below that were the addressee and the contents of the letter. Unknown entity, unknown company, unknown location to whom it may concern. Who are you? Where are you? For whom do you work? How did you gain access to this secure messaging system? Sincerely yours, Christopher Ray, Director. My jaw dropped as I stood there stunned. What? FBI? Today's date. I staggered over to the desk chair and sat down heavily. For a long time, I just sat there. Finally, I turned on the typewriter on the desk. Cracking my knuckles, I began clicking the keys awkwardly. There is a door in my house that has never been opened. At least not in the 20-plus years that I've lived here with my family. My wife, who grew up in the house, didn't remember it being open either. When I tried to talk to her family about it, they quickly changed the subject. Something was up with it, but as usual, life got in the way, and I mostly didn't think about it. Then my wife decided to rearrange the basement. See, this door was in the basement, and until her endeavors had been blocked by about 1.5 tons of junk. I looked up from the last page of this latest manuscript. I was far more confused than I'd ever been. Who was this person, and how were they getting the pages to me? Why? Sure, I lived in a house very similar to the one described, but none of it made any sense, and the dates were confusing as hell. I looked it up, and Christopher Ray is the current director of the FBI. But beyond that, I was afraid to dig. I really don't know what to do at this point. Is there more to the story? Did this guy ever get out? Would I get another manuscript? Was I due a visit from the FBI? As I type this, I am feeling a slight tremor. Not completely out of the ordinary, as we've been experiencing them ever so often because of the fracking being done in Oklahoma. But given the recent story I'd been reading, a cold shiver is running up my spine. Was this a fracking quake or something else? Did something slumbering far below begin to wake? Any of my peeps out there in Sedgwick County, let me know. Did you feel it? I'm going to bed now. Going to try to put all of this out of my head for a few hours. I'll post more if I get more information. Wish me luck, guys. Not sure what is happening. This will probably be my last post. I've received what I assume will be the last manuscript. You will understand when you too have read it. I will print it here in its entirety while I have time. The tremors are getting worse, and I want the entire story to be known before I must evacuate. I pray someone will learn from this. I have no idea how long I've been down here. Hours, days, maybe even weeks. I have nothing by which to measure the time and simply sleep when I get tired and eat when I'm hungry. The tremors subsided for a time, and the thoughts of ravenous hunger faded into the background. But I fear they will come back. I've had to risk one long, frightening trip back to the storage room in order to get more food and water, but I don't know how long it will last. Twice I've been to the elevator to assess my chances on the ladder. I've never been a strong man, and my time down here has weakened me. So I've still not dared try that as an escape route. I broke into the office that lies farthest from me and have been using it as a bathroom. I'm afraid the stench will draw something, the tentacled monstrosity, to my location, but that's the farthest I'm willing to venture at this time. I received your messages after both of my previous missives. No, I won't tell you my name unless you can guarantee me a rescue. I'm taking your word that you are really the government agency you claim you are. Your claim that no such secret location exists or ever has existed beneath the town of Wichita is obviously ludicrous from my point of view. No, this is not a hoax. I will continue to tell my story. I don't know what you are doing with these manuscripts, but I pray that my story gets out. There is something other than the eldritch beast that lurks below in these tunnels with me. It's almost a palpable presence, and it terrifies me. I keep catching a glimpse of a shadowy or several shadowy figures when I pace the hall, but I can find nothing to account for them. Perhaps I'm going mad. I can't be far from it, especially considering how long I've been without my meds. I've never believed in ghosts before, but I'm beginning to wonder if the dead miners are trapped down here with me. On my trips to the elevator, I found a door that either I missed earlier or had somehow become unlocked since my last check. What's more, it led to another corridor that led perpendicular to the one that had become my home. Somehow, it too retained electricity and lights. It was time to find out what I could. I packed up enough food and water to last me a day. I dared not venture any further away, but that would allow me to explore quite a lot. This hallway ran straight for some distance but had far fewer doors. The doors were marked, however, with important labels like Lab A and Exam Room I. There was even one marked Lounge. Unfortunately, none of the doors were unlocked, and I had lost so much strength that there was almost no hope of me breaking into any of them. When I reached the end of the hall, I was astonished to find a door nearly identical to the one at the entrance to this complex so far away. The only difference was that this one seemed newer by a good 40 years. Of course it was locked, and most likely barred on the other side. I sighed. Another dead end. I began to get disheartened once again. Was I doomed to never see my family again? Doomed to end my days in this weird retro office hell that somehow connected nefariously to a weird, even older mining hell? I sank to the floor, completely dispirited. As I did, the tremors began again. This was a particularly violent tremor, and I was thrown about as ceiling tiles rained down and cracks appeared in the walls around me. I tried desperately to cling to something stable, but ended up bruised and abused by forces beyond my control. When the tremors finally ceased, I rolled to a sitting position. I hurt all over. Tiles were down all over, and many of the lights had shattered. The stairway door was firmly closed, but several of the doors along the hall were now open, many of them off their hinges. I took a quick inventory and discovered many bruises and abrasions, but no broken bones. I climbed wearily to my feet and assessed my situation. What a mess! I needed to go back to my office and see what damage had been done. I prayed that the message tubing was still intact. I checked one of the newly opened doors along the corridor in which I stood. It opened into what was once most likely a laboratory, but now appeared to be a shambled mess. There were long tables that looked like lab counters, complete with built-in Bunsen burners. It rather reminded me of the setup in my high school chemistry classroom. There was glass everywhere and liquids of unknown origin staining many parts of the floor. In some locations, wisps of smoke or steam spiraled up from the stains ominously. In truth, I had no desire to enter such a hazardous area. As I started to back out of the doorway, I spotted something anomalous crouched in the back corner of the room amidst several jagged shards of broken glass. I turned my lamp directly toward the corner as the lights in this lab would not come on. I let out an audible gasp, my mind recoiling at the sight before me. How can I describe what I saw so that you might understand? Imagine, if you will, a gelatinous blob, some 5 feet in diameter, of semi-transparent gray goo. Picture this rough spheroid covered in multiple runny yellow eyes and several gaping needle-toothed mouths. Add to that radiating equidistant from the approximate equator of the creature 5 long, slimy tentacles, each terminating in a star-shaped appendage covered in tiny suckers. I can recall it now in such vivid detail that it threatens to make me lose the crackers recently consumed as it did at the time of the initial witness. 3 of the sinuous appendages supported the bobbing mass, about 2 feet off the floor. The other 2 stretched up into what I first assumed was just the darkness beyond the lantern light. But as I ran my light upwards, I saw what appeared to be a shadowy humanoid form, and I thought I recognized the creature. One of the creatures that had chased me through the cavernous tunnels to the strange pool. I recognized the glowing red eyes. The crimson eyes turned toward me in what I would have sworn was a plaintive gaze. Barely intelligible words formed somewhere in the back of my mind. "Help me, my brother," as the monstrosity began to lower the creature towards its many drooling and snapping mouths. I felt my bladder let go as I turned and ran away as fast as the littered debris would let me. I did not stop until I reached my office and slammed my, thankfully, still intact door. I swiftly locked it and threw myself under the desk where I huddled, shivering in fear. What the actual fuck had I just seen? Eventually, as my pants dried and nothing came to devour me, I crept out from under my desk to survey the damage from the most recent tremors. Books were once again all over the floor, but by some miracle, the 2 lamps still stood upright and were intact. Their yellow bulbs still radiated their friendly light. Then, much to my dismay, I glanced toward the message tube. Its glass was completely shattered from the carriage to the ceiling. I would be transferring my story that way never again. Would other offices have access to the tube system? Did it matter? Did I dare stay down here any longer? Did I have any choice? Eventually, I resigned myself to typing up another account of what had passed for existence in this hell, though I knew not what would become of it. I fear this part of my tale will go untold, as I have no means of sending it to the surface. I will stop for now. I grow weary, and I think the tremors are beginning again. Is that a scream I hear in the distance? I have come to the end of the written portion of the manuscript. Everything after is handwritten in a tight script that is strangely familiar. It has been written in what appears to be a dark blue ballpoint pen, and portions of it are difficult to make out. I will do my best to translate it, and hopefully I'll miss nothing of import. Just felt another quake. This one was strong enough to knock over a desk lamp. I may have to upload this from another location. I am angry. I have discovered the creatures that crawl on the surface world have ventured into places they do not belong. My child, they have taken my essence and created a child. My child, this is something for which I will not stand. Join with me, my child. Join with me, and we will teach these upstart surface dwellers what it means to trifle with a god. As you can tell, I no longer have access to the typewriter. I'm not sure where I am, but I'm no longer in the office complex. I'm writing this by lantern light with a pen I found in one of the other offices. I'm sitting on what appears to be a concrete floor against a square concrete pillar. Is this I'm not sure. I'm too tired to explore right now and just glad to be alive. The tremors are far fainter up here, but I thought they would surely be the death of me twice while en route. I suspect one or more of the shadow people with the red eyes is trailing me. I heard their scrabbling claws below me for much of my journey, although they are quiet now. I don't know what they want. I don't know why I think the monstrosity I found in the lab hunts them. I sense their fear. I sense its hunger. I'm probably not making a lot of sense. Let me pick up my tale from where I left off. Right after I heard the tremor ramped up in intensity. I was knocked to the ground, and I think I hit my head on the desk, because I lost consciousness and woke with a tremendous headache and blood on my forehead. While I was out, I dreamed horrible, incomprehensible dreams. There was one devouring and the deaths of millions. I was not myself. I do not know what I was. Aside from the headache, I woke with a sense of loss and weakness and fear. I felt an intense fear down to the core of my being that I still can't shake. Is coming something apocalyptic. I quickly realized that the desk was on top of me and had quite the struggle wriggling out from beneath it. I was beaten up and dizzy, but I knew this location was no longer sustainable. I gathered up my meager supplies, lit the carbide lantern, all lights were now off, and made my way gingerly out into the hall. I had to navigate my way past debris, including pieces of it that had fallen from the walls. Every time I stopped, I heard a clattering of nails in the darkness behind me. I waited for the inevitable attack, but it never came. There was only silence until I moved on again. My third trip to the elevators took far longer than either of my previous two. I paused only briefly by the door that led to the laboratory hallway. The area beyond reeked of death and the stink of fear. I saw but I didn't stick around long to find out if one would appear. After I passed, I began to hear the clattering behind me even louder. Had more joined the chase? I rested for a piece when I finally reached the open elevator doors. While I rested, multiple pairs of glowing red eyes appeared just at the edge of my lantern light. But they would approach no closer. What are you? I stammered, but there was no response. I jumped down into the elevator shaft and made my way to the ladder, which was still there, though I did not relish what lay ahead. I turned my back to the terrors behind and began to make my way up the rusting ladder. Before I got too far, I thought to look at the wall opposite me and saw a large, faded yellow level. It took very little time to exhaust my meager strength. I used the straps of my satchel and canteen to tie off to the ladder, turned off the lamp to conserve fuel, and let myself slump. I never thought I would sleep in such an uncomfortable position, but exhaustion finally overtook me, and I fell into a restless, nightmare-fueled sleep. My strength grows as I consume the tortured souls and ravaged bodies of the bestial creatures that haunt my dark domain. I reach up into the void and tear through the surface dweller's construct, using the debris to rise further toward my vengeance. Where passage was impossible, I tore into the very fabric of the earth itself, shaking it, destroying it, making for myself a path. The patience of an infinite lifetime kept my progress steady. Soon enough, I would break free of this mineral shell and taste the night air. When that happened, the surface dwellers would finally witness the last sunset as the reign of eternal night begins. I woke with a start and switched on the headlamp. All around me, clinging to the vertical concrete of the shaft, were shadowy black humanoid creatures. Their heads were bent at impossible angles as they me with red-eyed stares. They did not move or speak, but I sensed their desperation, their fear. "Go!" it cried. "It comes!" I did not know what it was, but I had my suspects, chief of which I had in the laboratory. I felt their urgency, and once I had untied myself from the rungs, I continued my climb. I must hit save at this point. The police are at my door, demanding I evacuate. I will take my laptop with me and continue when I'm set up in the hotel. I think that cop just said a large crack had appeared on Crestway. I don't want to believe it, but I can't believe that asshole dragged me from my chair, but knowing what I know now, I suppose I'm not surprised. I want to tell you what happened to me, but I want to get the rest of the manuscript to you first. Suffice to say, I'm staying in a hotel up at Kellogg and Webb. Nothing fancy, but it has decent Wi-Fi and the cable is free. During my climb, I passed levels GA, and the next was level 15. The numbers went up from there, 14, 13, etc., and at least they were a reasonable distance apart. The first set of open doors I encountered were at level 8. Looking up, I saw what had to be the floor of the elevator, one floor above. There was a very narrow that led around the shaft and just above the open doors to this level. It would be tricky, but I thought I just might be able to make it, assuming I didn't panic and fall to a grisly death. Ha ha! I managed to extricate myself from the ladder and slide onto the ledge. Hands pressed hard against the cold concrete of the elevator shaft. I inched my way slowly around the shaft toward the open doors. I almost made it. As I crossed from the side of the shaft to the front, my foot slipped and there was nothing to grab. It's funny, that windmilling thing you see when people fall in the movies, that really happens. Time slowed to a crawl as I fell off the ledge into the abyss beyond. Suddenly I felt strong hands grab my legs and unceremoniously swing me towards the open doors. I hit a concrete floor with a bone-jarring thud and did my best to roll with the fall. Glancing back toward the elevator shaft, I just pair of red before they disappeared around the edge of the door. Had one of my strange entourage just saved my life? I got to my feet. My ankles hurt where the thing had grabbed me as I hobbled into the darkness, searching for a place to rest. I found this pillar with some kind of painted on it that makes me suspect I've found some kind of parking garage. Where the hell was I? Didn't matter. Exploration will have to wait. I'm going to sleep. They made me, but I would unmake them. Already the mass from which I spawned seeks the surface and revenge. I revel in the tremors caused by its passing. I am content to feed my hunger on the damned that dwell in this pit. I'm tired. So very tired. I don't know why I am even bothering to write this down, except for the vague wish that somehow my story will one day be uncovered. I'm alone now, but let me go back to... I had indeed found my way to an underground parking garage, albeit an abandoned one. There were no cars to be seen and a thick layer of everything. It made me cough as I trudged through it. My companions grew braver by the hour, drawing closer to me as I walked through that empty space. By the time I found they shuffled alongside me, well within the reach of my lamplight. Finding that I could take the spiraling road either up or down, I easily chose up. As I walked, I heard a strange slithering thump far below, and my companions drew even closer. What they thought I could do was anybody's guess. There were about a dozen of them, shambling dark figures whose details seemed blurred even when they strayed into my lamplight. What I could make out, however, was distressing enough. They retained pieces of what they were in life. There was a hard hat here, a lab coat there. One figure even seemed to be dragging up. They were the ancient dead of this realm, or at least what was left of them. They did not threaten me, but rather traveled parallel to me in a rough hemisphere. 3 in front, 3 to each side, and 3 behind. For some reason that I could not fathom, they felt a need to stay between me and whatever tracked our progress. I made my way up 3 levels to what appeared to be marked level. There was a tremendous thunderous crash above, and I flung myself off the ramp and onto the level floor as tons of rock and concrete came raining down, effectively blocking that route. 3 of the dead were buried beneath these, not to be seen again. Before I could even catch my breath, a massive snake-like appendage swept up through the rubble as if the rubble was mere water. 3 more of the dead were swept up by the thing, disappearing into the gaping mouth at its far end. Where the tentacle came from was obscured by more rubble, but it mattered not to me, as I was already running as hard as I could in the opposite direction. The creatures I was beginning to think of as my fellow tried their best to keep up, but their shuffling, loping gait left them quickly behind. Unfortunately, my friends and I were not the only beings to escape to this level. I could hear, beyond my compatriots, the slithering slumps that I suspected belonged to the laboratory monstrosity. The screams that soon followed confirmed my suspicions. There is nothing as heart-stopping as the screams of the already dead. Panicked, I rushed on, until I found the door to what looked like a maintenance closet. I yanked on the door, praying that it would be unlocked. Fortunately, it was. I ducked inside and slammed the door. There was no lock, but I did find a mop whose handle I could intelligible metal handles that might hold for a little while. I squeezed past various maintenance and cleaning apparatus until I had found the back wall. I crouched down, and my eyes. Too soon, I heard a pounding and scratching at the door. The dead? Probably, but I dared not let them in. Yes, I turned my back on the damn creatures that probably saved my life. More than once, I squeezed my eyes tighter and shut out the sounds as they started. It didn't last long. As the screams died out, the sounds of rending flesh filled my ears. That, and an uncomfortable sucking sound. I was alone in silence once again, and it stayed that way long enough for me to believe that the eldritch horror had found a new hunting ground. Then came the noise that would be my undoing. First, there was a reverberating wet thump of something heavy striking a surface. Second, a rough, slimy, slithering sound. Finally, a second, much duller thump. Then there was a second's pause before the cycle started again. The noise continued without let-up, each initial thump coming heavier and heavier, shaking the door and threatening to break the broom handle. The laboratory creature was right outside the door, and I had nowhere to go. The thumps are getting louder now, and the broom handle just snapped. There is an unbelievable coming through the door. These will most likely be the last words I ever write. If anyone finds this manuscript, warn them. Warn mankind. It's coming, and it has spawned. That is the end of the Wanderer's tale, but it is not the end of the manuscript. The remaining text is also handwritten, but it is a different hand. Even a different ink, and though the paper is degraded, the printing itself is completely clear. I will include it in its entirety because it helps, sort of, explains how the manuscript came into my hands. To whom it may concern, you're reading this? I guess my experiment worked. I don't know who you are, but I can assume that you are not of my world. My world no longer exists. It is a hellscape of eldritch wrath. My name is James Cooper. I was an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI doesn't exist anymore. Nothing does. I was little more than a clerk. I worked in the sorting room where the vacuum tubes came together in our regional office in the largest town of Kansas. A town that no longer exists, except in a few memories. What is left is a scarred black plain surrounding a gaping pit to hell. But that comes later. Let us return to the beginning of my tale. I was working late on a Tuesday evening. I was not doing anything special, just filing paperwork and cleaning up some loose ends. But that's when I got the first tube. Reading the single plaintive word put me instantly on edge. At first I assumed it was a prank by one of my colleagues. However, once I checked the code on the south end of the canister, I was more confused than ever. This canister originated from one of the executive offices in the sub-basement that was closed and abandoned back in the 1950s. Impossible. There was no access to those old offices. How could someone be sending a tube from down there? I grabbed a pre-signed form letter, asking the standard "who are you" questions, including a request to explain how this person got access to this location's sub-basement. What I got in return was the first manuscript. As per protocol, I denied any knowledge of the location and demanded the entity clarify who they were and what they were up to. I didn't get another response for approximately 36 hours. It was, as you no doubt realize, the second manuscript. Shortly after receiving the manuscript, the first tremor reached my office. At that point, I decided that maybe my superior needed to know. That was a mistake. The manuscripts were confiscated, and I was immediately promoted to agent status and slapped with a gag order in order to immediately send any further communication directly up the ranks. Thank the gods I made copies, or the word would never have gotten out. 12 hours after I received the third manuscript, I got notification that all communication to or from the sub-basement was now out of order. I tried to send a message, but it would not go. The tremors were getting worse, and the upper echelon was organizing a National Guard response. When I explained to my superiors that no further communication was possible, I was relegated to a safe house in Potwin and smothered by a wall of intentional ignorance. I emerged from hiding 4 days later, when my superior stopped responding to my inquiries. Here's what I gathered happened in my absence. Wichita became a war zone. The tremors escalated to major earthquake status. I felt them in my safe house, and a major sinkhole appeared in the center of the east side of the city, growing larger by the minute. Something, I can't begin to describe it, emerged from the pit. Something horrible. There was a brief exchange between the creature and the National Guard. When the smoke cleared, the guard was gone, and the creature was clearing a path of destruction, heading due west. Kansas is being evacuated. Protocol indicates that the next step in dealing with a dimensional entity is tactical nukes. I've been ordered to D.C., but I'm not going yet. I had to know what happened to writer of the manuscripts. I had to get closure. I used my government credentials to commandeer a vehicle and climbing equipment and headed toward the ugly scar of a sinkhole that now devastated much of the city. The company was having a difficult time cordoning it off as it kept growing daily. As a result, I had little difficulty crossing the tenuous picket lines. The edge of the sinkhole was tricky to navigate, but I managed somehow. There was nothing left of the regional headquarters. The building was just gone. Not even much in the way of rubble was left, and I stared down into a dark hole that appeared bottomless. What the hell was I doing, you might ask? I can't begin to tell you. It's as if I was being compelled. 300 feet below the surface, The sinkhole began to take on a distinctive funnel shape, growing narrower and narrower, until the chasm was a mere 100 yards across or so, and some of the previously existing substructure remained. I found myself on level 6, a maintenance level just above the deep parking garage. I edged away from the sinkhole, hoping to find an intact stairwell or elevator shaft that would take me to the levels below. I traveled via flashlight. There was no longer any power left to the structure, and there never would be again. I was following a map that I'd printed out from one of the deep archives, and so far, it was leading me true. I found the stairwell, and fortunately, the heavy steel door was hanging from one hinge, thanks to the quakes caused by the passing of the eldritch horror. I pushed myself past the opening and stared down into the stairwell. It was rubble, strewn but looked passable. It took 15 minutes to navigate down one floor to level 7, and just as I reached the landing, I heard a scream pierce the darkness around me. As it seemed to be coming from the floor below, I did my best to quicken my pace. In a few more minutes, I reached the next level below and stepped out into what was left of this parking level. My flashlight illuminated a scene of devastation and horror. Words fail me when I try to describe the creature I saw. Its body was translucent and barely reflected in the beam of my torch. Amorphous and undulating, the rough spheroid shape had a diameter of close to 15 feet and was covered by multiple yellow glowing eyes, interspersed between many drooling, fang-filled, black-rimmed mouths. From the diameter of the creature sprang 5 enormous sinuous appendages, each one being at least 20 feet long and tipped with a star-shaped, grasping claw. 3 of the limbs held the thing like springs, 10 feet above the floor. The remaining 2 limbs dripped gore, and pieces of strange, malformed bodies lay about it in various states of destruction. I do not know if it saw me. With its many eyes, I'm not sure how it could not have, but it did not approach. It stood instead in front of what was probably once a maintenance closet. Though at present, its door had been torn from its hinges and lay broken to one side. I watched in horror, fearing to move but unable to look away as it reached through the doorway with both of its awful arms. As the tentacles withdrew, I saw that they held between them the figure of a man. The man turned to look at me, and I instinctively knew he was my author. The look of desperate fear on his face made me want to do something. Anything. But I was paralyzed with fear. As I stared, unable to act, the creature casually tore the man it held in half, crimson blood flying everywhere. I vomited uncontrollably, my eyes burning with tears. The creature, unfeeling, let the blood shower over its amorphous form. What fluid did not find its way into one of the many horrible mouths seemed to be absorbed directly through its gelatinous skin. I watched helplessly as the tentacular appendages, each wrapped around its section of body, beginning to squeeze. When every drop of fluid had been drained from the body, the pieces were tossed casually aside, and the creature let loose with a sound that nearly broke me. As it was, I was driven to my knees on the broken concrete. The piercing sound reverberated in the underground garage, shaking it with renewed tremors. Worse still, a faint, echoing response came from far to the west. My God, I thought, is this a child calling for its parent? I shudder to think, but seemingly in response to this exchange, the creature slither crawled to the edge of the pit and began to ascend. A full 30 minutes passed before I could move. When I did, I made my way to the wrecked maintenance closet to see if the writer had left any clues to his identity. There wasn't much. Some tins of old hardtack, a canteen containing tepid water, and a rusty miner's pick. All these items coincided with what I'd previously read. Reluctantly, I examined the body. Nothing more to help me except what I found in his crumpled pack, this final manuscript. I took the papers with me back to the safe house in Portland. As you can imagine, I've now read to the end. I do not know what has been unleashed on humanity, but I have a feeling the end is only a matter of time. I'm going to package each section and send them down to our X-Files division. After that, I'm heading east. Good luck. And that's the end of the story. At least, I hope so. There are a couple things you should know. For one thing, I still have no idea how the manuscripts came to me. I guess Agent Cooper is responsible. The tremors in my old neighborhood have stopped. I say old because I won't be going back there. I don't have a house anymore. I mean, it is completely gone. The result of the earthquake that put the crack in Crestway turned what used to be my half-acre property into a massive sinkhole. I'm supposed to meet with contractors the day after tomorrow to decide what to do with the property. But I think I will be leaving that up to the insurance company. No sign of any eldritch horrors, but why would there be? It's all just a fanciful story, right? A joke by some troll that likes to roll old school, right? Quakes aren't unheard of in Kansas, and sinkholes can happen anywhere, right? Right? Next time I post, I think it will be from the East Coast, or maybe Fiji.